Hi everyone, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Streamlining Your Procurement Process with Dynamics GP. We appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to join us today. There are a couple of housekeeping items we'd like to mention before we begin the presentation. All attendees are in listen-only mode. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please either raise your hand so that we can unmute you, or you can submit them through the GoToWebinar question box. We'll be answering questions throughout the presentation, and we'll also follow up after the presentation to answer any additional questions. I'd like to introduce today's speaker. We have Jeff Smith, who's a Senior Client Success Manager here at Socius. So at this point, Jeff, I believe we're ready to transition over to you.
Thank you very much, Lindsay, and thanks to all of you who are taking time out of your day to visit with us today. I really appreciate it, and I think you'll find that this is a very useful presentation. And I want to reiterate that if you have questions as we go along, certainly make sure that you feel free to put those questions in the question box, and we'll make sure that we stop every so often to answer them. So ultimately, what we're trying to accomplish today is just to provide you some tips to help you streamline your procurement processes and enhance vendor relationships leveraging Dynamics GP. And so we're going to talk about several things. We're going to talk about the actual business workflow that you'll go through, and we'll kind of use that as the infrastructure for which the rest of the presentation will occur. We'll talk about different components of the presentation as well. So there will be primarily Dynamics GP application here, but there will be a couple what we'll call ISV or independent software vendor products that we'll talk about as well. We will go through demonstrations, but the demonstrations are really going to be, and I apologize for this, but I think it's the best way for us to be able to get through the entire flow. We will go through all of this with screenshots through PowerPoint. But if you would like to talk to us in more detail about these things, we certainly can make arrangements and do a one-on-one presentation as well. We will then talk about the solution workflow, and at the end we'll talk about what benefits you should expect to see from all of this. So without any further ado, we'll go ahead and move forward. So first of all, and by the way, this deck will actually be available to you. Lindsay will make sure that you'll have the access to this so that you can use that as reinforcement for the content that we discussed today. So this is a Visio diagram of a typical process that we may see within your business. So there are several constituents that are involved in the process. Anywhere from a requester who's asking to buy goods or services for their job. There's an approver. Oftentimes what happens, and we'll talk about this workflow, oftentimes what happens is that someone requests something, but somebody else has to give it the okay to make sure that that will work. We'll also have the warehouse involved. Somebody's going to be receiving goods that come in, and that may not be a warehouse. That could be individual departments where the information is sent. All of this is going to have some sort of an effect on the accounting group, as they will play a role in regards to making sure that vendor invoices are getting paid. They also may play a role in approving the addition of new vendors that you may choose to work with, and we'll talk about a workflow that allows that. The purchasing, you may have a purchasing department or a buyer. In other organizations, there may be multiple buyers within each department, and then also the vendor. So we're going to set up guidelines that says from the purchasing department, if the request has been approved, but to get the goods we have to purchase them from a vendor we've not done work before, we can actually send that vendor information through an approval process. Oftentimes the accounting department will then be responsible for approving that vendor. Once they're approved, then we can actually go through the process of creating a purchase order for the goods or services. and the vendor will then receive and will fulfill the order, and they will then ship that product to us, and then they will invoice us for those goods. Obviously, that will flow then back to the accounting group, who will then receive the invoice and make sure it gets paid. So this is the general business workflow and structure that we're going to follow as we go through this process. So we're going to start off by talking about requisitions. Not every organization has a formal requisition process, and many who do have a paper workflow process. So what I wanted to talk about here is I wanted to talk about the fact that we can do requisitions. We can automate the workflow from the request to the approval to the actual turning of that requisition into a purchase order. So, and we can do that in two different places that we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about Dynamics GP, which since GP 2013 Release 2, there has been a requisition workflow wrapped around requisitions, or a product that we highly recommend for requisition workflow, especially if it's more complex needs, called ReQlogic. So one thing I wanted to make clear is in each one of these different workflows, I'm going to show either the ISV product or I'm going to show Dynamics GP, because there's a lot of commonality in regards to how the GP workflow is set up. I don't want to be redundant. So we'll definitely make sure that you get the concepts here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by talking about ReQlogic. And ReQlogic is a cloud-based solution that integrates very tightly with Dynamics GP. One of the key structures within ReQlogic is what's called a routing policy. And while this is a little bit of an eye chart, I just kind of wanted to talk about what routing policies can look like. So as an example, I have a routing policy that's called Corporate Requisitions, and you can see that it actually has several steps here. So first of all, the first step is any requisition that comes in, once it's been submitted, goes to the manager of the employee that will be submitting the requisition. And inside of ReQlogic, we have the ability to define the hierarchy within the organizations to make sure that that person, that goes to the right area. But there's a lot of things to consider beyond the manager. So in this case, it may go to the manager, but you may decide that you'd like to take several different routes. Some of the variables that you might want to consider are, is this item IT related? Is there a certain dollar limit that managers have the right to approve? Do we need to send FYIs or just hey, for your information type of notifications to others within the organization to make sure that they're aware? Are these purchases project related? If they're project related, is there a project manager that needs to actually see? So as you can see, I have managers, I have IT items, I have the ability to have project approval, and that can actually flow into a project manager. Also, one thing that's really key in all of this is the ability to manage budgets. So as someone makes a request, they may be, I won't use the word oblivious, but they may not know how they are tracking versus their budget for that particular line item in the budget. And so ReQlogic has the ability to actually track against budget. And so you can see that these workflows can actually be very complex depending on the size and complexity of the organization and the guidelines for which the organization is set up. So just to give you some sense, because it is a cloud-based solution, each individual user is going to have their own login. They're going to have the ability to have what's called an approval queue. So if they're an approver, they may have requests that come in for particular purchases that are being requested, and then they can actually see this here. We also have the ability to set up email notifications and the like to make sure that people are staying engaged in the process and know when they need to approve something. We can also set time guidelines in regards to that. But what you can see with Andy Hobbs, so I'm logged in as Andy Hobbs. Andy Hobbs has one requisition to approve, but they also have their own requisitions that they put in here. And you can see in this dashboard that anyone can have when they log in, that they're going to have the ability to see the description of what's being purchased, the total amount, if it's known at that point, and the status. So you can notice that we have one that has a status of purchase order, another one that says approved, another one that says not submitted. So as these workflows are defined, you have the ability to follow the transactions. So this then is a little bit of an eye chart, but the idea is that this is the requisition entry window. So as a user, you comes in, you have the ability to set in some basic information at what you might call a header level. Each user can be assigned to a routing policy, but that can be changed if necessary. And one of the key things here is that an individual will have the ability to either select the vendor or not. Maybe the common person doesn't know that we get our laptops from Dell. They may not know what model they need, those types of things. So the system can be configured to be as simple and with as few fields as necessary to get the basic user what they need. But then as it goes through its workflow process, perhaps the IT department might add the model and the vendor and then also the cost based upon what they know versus what the individual requisitioner would know. So here's the header information. We have the ability to attach notes that can go to the vendor, notes that can be internal notes, and so forth. So all of this information can then flow through the system. What you'll notice down here at the bottom is that you have it in your line items, and you can have as many line items as you need that make sense for a particular requisition. And then once that requisition has been completed, you have the ability to simply click on the submit button, and it will then start back through its workflow process. So once we've submitted, then you can you'll notice that again we'll talk about the approval queue. Now we're logged in as William Kane because William Kane is Andy Hobbs' approver, and so once that requisition has been submitted, William Kane will then get a notification as well, either through email or through the user interface, or both. Whoops, went too far. This is actually what a requisition approver would see. They'll actually have the ability to have the heading information and all of the line items. You'll notice that there's a variety of tabs here that we'll go through as we talk about this. But ultimately, they have the ability to approve each individual line. They can reject lines if there's multiple lines, and they can approve others. And then once they've reviewed, then they can complete that. The approver is also going to have the ability to ask questions that can then be routed back to the original requester. One thing that will be very unique and does not exist in the GP requisition tool is the ability to do a functionality called punch out. So you'll notice here that we can pick an individual line and we can click on a little shopping cart icon, and our what are called punch out vendors, which there are thousands of in the United States alone, then you can actually go out to each vendor's website, make selections, but rather than going through the normal checkout process, you'll actually bring those items back in through your requisition workflow, approval workflow. So here you can see I'm on CDW's website. I can go through and select the items that are available to my company to purchase. I can get right into the details. So in this case, maybe what I need is I need a Microsoft Surface Pro, and I need an Apple iPad Air 2 Wi-Fi tablet. Actually, in this case, I'm just going to buy the Surface Pro. You'll notice I have my normal checkout options, just as if I were making a personal purchase. But what happens is once I check out, I get a window that says, hey, thank you for shopping. Please click the Transfer Shopping Cart button to transfer your shopping cart. And this will actually then bring that request right back into ReQlogic. So now I have a requisition for our Microsoft Surface Pro 4. Notice the item is a punch-out item. Here's the requester, the company, the routing policy, the cost, everything that I would have gotten through that process. Now what's going to happen is if I click on the routing policy, you'll see that the next person in line to approve this is William Kane, due to the fact that this was an IT item, and William Kane is responsible for IT. Also, as you go through this process, you'll have a full status of the steps that individuals have gone through to get us to this point. So you can see the document was created, it was submitted, a routing step was started, the document was routed for user approval, it was updated, the routing step was approved, etc. So ultimately, this status can actually run you all the way through the payment of the invoice for this particular good. All right, and so then basically at this point, we now have that punch-out item, quantity 1, and you can see that it then creates a purchase order that then lands in Dynamics GP. Now, I'm only showing the ReQlogic requisitions piece. I'm going to show GP for some of the other workflows that also exist in ReQlogic. But in general, ReQlogic, especially at the requisition level, is going to be a little bit more full-featured. And so if requisitions is something that you want to add to your organization to build in controls, feel free to talk to someone at Socius, your consulting lead, your account manager or client success manager, and get the conversation started, talk about your requirements, and then we can lead you through this process. So if we compare ReQlogic versus GP, well, first of all, one thing that I didn't include here is the Dynamics GP requisitions are included. They're free. They're in part of your licensing in what's called the starter pack in the GP licensing. It leverages Active Directory for hierarchy, and so ultimately it is a nice option for many of our clients, depending on the complexity of their process, the number of people involved, etc. Now, what does ReQlogic provide is it provides punch-out functionality that we talked about. So you're linking your requisition process right back into your vendor's website so that you can do that type of work. It also will provide you with online receiving. So that means that you don't have to have a GP user in GP doing the receiving process. You can do it with a much less expensive ReQlogic license. If you do RFQs with your vendors, then you have the ability to do RFQ management or request for quote management. And it also does the budget comparison functionality. So all of this is built into ReQlogic that would be an enhancement beyond what we can do in GP at this point. But either case, it's an enhancement to allow you to build controls into your procurement process. All right, so now what I wanted to talk a little bit about was really vendor onboarding. So in many organizations, there are controls that are put in place. Someone is responsible, or some ones are responsible for saying who we can do business with and who we can't. We call that vendor onboarding. So there's an approval process that's required. This process actually exists in Dynamics GP. It can also exist in ReQlogic, even though it's not labeled here. So this should give you a little bit of an idea of what the Dynamics GP workflow windows look like. You'll notice under purchasing, we have payables batch approval, we have payables transaction approval, which I'll also go through, purchase order approval, requisition approval, and then vendor approval. So what you're building here is you're building a workflow with a number of steps that your process includes to do the different functions here. In my case, what I'm doing is I'm doing a simple vendor approval process, and this is a very simple example. You may need more steps included to make sure you meet your needs. So first step, you're defining a workflow that I'm calling vendor approval. Within the vendor approval, you then build in steps. So in my case, it's important for me to have the W-9, and then I just simply have a process for which we say yes or no. There may be far more to this, like I said. So there's some rules that you can set in regards to this. You have the ability to send notifications for others within the organization. You have the ability to allow a user or approver to delegate their task. So for instance, I might be able to say, I'm on vacation, so I'm going to give this job to Lindsay, so that if we need to add new vendors while I'm gone, somebody's here and responsible for it. So these are several of the things that are allowed. Notice that there's also an activation button here, so once you've fine-tuned your workflow, then you can activate it, and it will have an effect on your screens, and I'll show you some of that. So then once I get into the individual steps, you'll notice that there's a step type of task. So in your workflow, the steps can either be a task or they can be an approval. So in this case, it's important for me to attach the W-9 to the vendor's record. So that's task. And once that's completed, then we have the ability to complete that, and it'll move to the next step in my workflow, which is the vendor approval. Now, a couple things to keep in mind. In my case here, I'm not segregating this based upon it's an IT item versus another type of item. I'm really simply saying one person is responsible, and that's this sample user ID down here called GP Test Demo. I can define rules on time limits, so how much time do I have to approve that before it then goes. There's a couple rules we can set in regards to either canceling the requisition altogether or sending it to the next person in the approval chain. There's also the ability to send messages. So you can set up template emails, and actually approvals. One of the nice things about this is that in both solutions is that email approval is possible. And then I can also do document attachment. So that attachment might be the W-9, but it also could be a contract or something else as well. Then I get into the approval step. And so you can see that I can define the sequence for which this all happens. One thing to take note of is that you can sequence the steps, or you can have steps that happen simultaneously. Now, when you get into your payables, if you're going to activate the vendor approval workflow, then you'll notice that your payables windows change some. You'll notice that there's a submit button, there's a view history button, and there's a gray bar across here that says vendor approval not submitted. So here I have set up my vendor information, I click submit, and then I can actually put in some comments that will follow through the workflow. Now, once I've done that, you'll notice that the status of this vendor has changed to pending task completion by the approver. And so the system is actually tracking this through its process. Now, the approver is going to get an email that might look like this. And the nice thing is that the approver does not have to have a GP license if they're approving through their email. And I will go back and talk about the requisitions in a little while in regards to how GP handles that. So, but you can see here that there's a hyperlink to complete the task, to delegate, etc. And if you are going to complete the task, then you can fill in notes and click task complete. it will then follow through to the next person in the line. So GP Test Demo was responsible for attaching the W-9, and Jeff Smith is now responsible for approving the vendor. So now it's sitting in Jeff's queue to be approved. I'm then going to get an email that says, hey, you've been assigned a vendor for approval. Here's the vendor. You can approve, you can reject, you can delegate. This email can be somewhat customized to include certain information as well, so that it makes it easier for the approver to do that. And again, a window very similar to what we saw before in regards to the user approval through email. Lastly, in regards to the vendor onboarding, you're going to notice that there is a workflow audit trail. So you can see that Jeff submitted, GP Test Demo completed the task of adding the W-9, and then, and this is just a sample, obviously, I wouldn't be approving my own, but then you could see that Jeff gave final approval. The good thing about this is that if you activated workflow, I cannot use that vendor until they've been approved. So if I tried to enter a transaction or an invoice, I wouldn't be able to do it. So I've gone through, I do want to talk about one more thing. So the person entering the payable is typically a user in GP, but the approvers don't have to be GP users and don't have to have user licenses to do the vendor approval. They can just use their email. In regards to the requisitions, if I'm using GP for requisitions, then there is actually a license, what's called a self-service license for requesters, so that they can do their approval, so they can do their request in the GP interface, and they can do that in the web client or in the regular client. But there is actually a very reduced cost license that would be needed for people to enter their requisitions. The approvers, again, whether it's requisitions or vendor approval, there's no licensing required. Okay, so the next step is purchase orders. So what we're going to talk about is purchase orders. So this is, again, the same interface. All of the workflows are set up in the same place. I do have the ability to issue a purchase order, but I can put an approval workflow before it actually can be sent to the vendor. Some people would say, hey, if you're doing requisitions, you might not do a purchase order approval, and that be true, but maybe some people just want to issue it, create the purchase order, get it approved, and then it'll go to the vendor, and you can skip the requisition process altogether. So it's just another option. So in regards to that, many of the same screens. You can see in my case, I just have a simple one, but the PO approval could be sent to individual managers based upon the department, those types of things. And again, you can see very similar windows and the idea of creating a email template, being able to do attachments, all of that can be done just like what we showed in the vendor approval process. Now, one thing that you can do is you can set up conditions. So this is an example where we say if the purchase order subtotal is greater than $1,000, it may need to go to a specific user. So maybe the purchase order goes to your manager. If it goes beyond their approval limit, it might have to go to a second layer. And that's what this screen would allow you to do. Once you've submitted the document for approval, so first of all, you're going to see that this document must be submitted for approval first. This is the message I get if I tried to print out a purchase order prior to getting approval. And then what you can see here is what the PO would look like. And again, the same gray bar, the same workflow, history, the ability to do attachments, all of that works right here. Now, This is where I wanted to elaborate a little bit more, that you have the ability to customize the email template to include a lot of information. So whether that be an attachment, it could also be just a lot of information that is necessary for the approver to make their decision. And again, they can approve, reject, or delegate based on these hyperlinks built into the email. Once it's been approved, now we have a purchase order, and at this point, that purchase order could actually be sent on to the vendor. But if you activate the workflow, you're going to have to go through those steps following your workflow that you've designed to make this work. So I'm going to stop for a minute before I go on. And Lindsay, we're about halfway through. Do we have any questions so far?
There are no questions so far.
Okay. Well, I just encourage you, if you have any questions, to feel free to ask. So the idea of what we've covered so far is to build some structure and some control into your procurement process, whether that be building a workflow approval for requisitions before they become a purchase order, or whether it be creating a purchase order and requiring approval there, or just legitimizing what vendors we do business with. So all three of those workflows are certainly very important. So the next thing, and by the way, in regards to using ReQlogic for the ability to enter a requisition and also to do receiving, ReQlogic leverages the Dynamics GP purchase order module. So when it goes through that approval, ultimately that data ends up landing right inside of GP. Okay, whether that be a requisition that gets approved to create the purchase order, or whether that be receiving against a purchase order. All right. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was inside of Dynamics GP, there are different types of purchase orders. So there's a standard purchase order. The standard purchase order is, oftentimes the one-off purchase order for goods to fill a need. You also have a similar one in regards to a drop ship purchase order. And the drop ship purchase order allows you to purchase goods, but rather than having those goods shipped to you, they can be drop shipped to a customer location. And to take that a step further, you actually have the ability to link that purchase order to a sales order. So that purchase order could be created as a result of a sales order with items that need to be ordered on that. And then lastly, there's what's called a blanket purchase order, and we'll talk about those as well. And then the other thing I wanted to talk around purchase orders is the ability to use what's called the purchase order generator, which is a tool that allows you to leverage the minimum and maximum settings for items that you maintain in inventory. So here is an example of entering a blanket purchase order. One thing that you'll notice here is that the type field is marked as blanket. This is a drop-down window, so the standard, the drop ship, and the blanket are all options that you can choose. The system then defines the purchase order number. You select the vendor, the item, and basically at this point, I then, because I've designated that as a drop ship purchase or a blanket purchase order, you're going to see that then there's an additional window that allows me to say, okay, I'm ordering 1,000 of these, and I wanted them shipped in 3 separate shipments, 250 on April 30th, 250 on May 30th, and 500 on June 30th. And then you can release all 3 of these at one time or individually. So the idea of a blanket purchase order is one of 2 things. I can control a blanket purchase order by the quantity or by the value. In this example, I'm using the quantity. So that would be, I'm placing an order for a certain number of items. I'm having those items delivered to me in 3 separate shipments in this example. But I also could create a purchase order based upon a certain dollar value, and then I can purchase against that purchase order to reach that value. So when I create a blanket and I create that schedule, then ultimately what ends up happening is I now have additional line items that are put onto the purchase order that break it down based upon the schedule that I've created. So you can see they're all the same item, 250, 250, 500. And you can see then that in this example, this is a different example, but the idea of using the dollar value option. So if I'm cleaning equipment, etc., if I'm doing rentals, those types of things, then I have the ability to do it by dollar. And so here's an example of that. So this was based on value. Control extended cost is 1,500. I got 3 different lines, 3 different deliveries. So it might be a service that comes to my office and provides service to me, these 3 different time schedules. So that's a blanket purchase order. Hopefully that makes some sense, and it would bring value to the way you're using GP today. The next thing I wanted to get into was purchase order generator. And really what this is this is just a tool that allows me to create purchase orders based upon a purchase order date, and I can restrict it by item, by site, by buyer, by vendor, by item class. And what this does is it allows me to find any items that are below their reorder level, and it will then suggest purchase orders for me. So in this example, you can see that by running that, I actually got these 2 line items. This suggests that I order 20 of this particular cord and 20 of this phone. And then basically what happens is, based upon this, I then click generate purchase orders, and this will actually create purchase orders for me. So just to be clear, this really focuses on the use of purchase orders. The other thing that it does not do is it really doesn't take any time consideration in it. It doesn't place any emphasis on time, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And what I mean by that is that it doesn't know that maybe that phone cord takes 6 weeks to get. It just knows that I'm below my my minimum. So there are more advanced ways to address that. In the manufacturing environment, there's what's called MRP, which allows me to purchase goods based on lead time and production schedules, things like that. So if any of you are in the manufacturing arena and use GP for manufacturing, then we can bypass this purchase order generator and we can use MRP. Also, there are products out there. There are a number of them, and if you have questions or if it sounds like something you might want, there are some independent software vendors that have what we call demand planning solutions that allow us to order based upon historical trends and different metrics that would allow you to make decisions on when you should have items in and when you need to order them based upon history. I'm going to stop again for a moment and see if there are any questions on purchase order generator, blanket purchase orders, dropship purchase orders, any of those things.
There is nothing yet.
Okay, thanks, Lindsay. All right, so now we're going to talk about receiving. As we said, we can do receiving in 2 different places. We have the ability to do receiving in Dynamics GP, or we can do it in ReQlogic. So I'm going to go ahead and this is a little hard to read, but the idea is this is a receiving window that exists in ReQlogic. And you're saying, well, why would I do receiving in ReQlogic? Well, the reason you may do receiving in ReQlogic is that a user license for ReQlogic is far less expensive than a user license for GP. And so if you have someone that just does receiving and you already have ReQlogic, then this might be a really nice tool. And it's very simple in regards to what it allows you to do is it allows you to select where you're going to receive to, what the vendor is. You'll see the items, then you can enter your quantities and simply submit those. And what that does is then that creates a receiving transaction in your purchase order module. But it doesn't require that you log into GP, so it's a far less expensive investment if you're using ReQlogic for other things. What happens is once we've done that receiving, then it's going to land right here. And so you can see that what I did is I received that CDW item, that Surface Pro 4, $1,260.03. You can see here. And that came directly from a receiving transaction in ReQlogic, and I receive it as a shipment. Now, I could have also manually entered that receipt right here in the GP. But the nice thing about it is, again, like we talked about, the investment. So, just to compare ReQlogic versus GP on the receiving side, is Dynamics GP receiving requires that you invest in a GP full user license, whereas ReQlogic uses a low-cost ReQlogic user license. So it can be a very substantial difference in regards to if you're already doing requisitions, it might not be a bad idea to have your receiving done through this way. Okay. So what I wanted to cover next was really then the invoice process. So we see clients take a lot of different approaches. Some of our clients use requisitions and go through the approval process there. A few of them even use the purchase order approval process. And then others basically do the approval on the invoice side. So when the invoice comes in, it gets routed out to a particular user or individual based upon the workflow that you've defined. So in this case, I can do invoice processing both through GP, or I can do that directly through ReQlogic. So I'm going to show you the GP side. So in GP, I have a workflow that is very specific. I created a very simple one that said, if it's business, if it's science, we did this for a small school. So they have a business department, a science department, an English department, and this is just a very brief setup. But the idea would be that if a particular transaction is labeled business, then it's going to go to a particular user. Here you can see the normal, again, is it activated? What are my conditions? What are my options? We talked about all this around notifications and approval delegation, etc. And then here's where I can set my conditions. So what I did is I was trying to be creative. So in accounts payable, when I get an invoice, I was using the shipping method field, and I was using my department there because there's no natural field inside of the GP payables transaction that's for business. But because I'm not really using the shipping method field, then I'm actually just going to use it, and I can create lookups and so forth, and that would then route based upon this particular rule. Again, you can see who's it assigned to because it's business. Is there a time limit? Do I send a message? And I can create then that standard email template. And then do I also allow the document attachment? So one of the things that's very key in invoice approval is the ability to have the approver have access to looking at the document itself. And in many places, that still happens to be a paper with a stamp, and then it gets sent through interoffice mail. But this is really automating that process. So what I did is created my rule, and I created it for each department. So Lisa Smith is going to approve the science department. And then you can see here's where I can create the template with the content that I want to see through the approval process. And it's simply a one-time setup, and then everything happens automatically. Here's where you can select the fields that you'd like to include based upon this type of an approval. And then in our payables transaction, you'll notice that, again, we're going to have the gray bar across the top. So this has not been submitted at this point. You see there's an attachment feature, and I can attach multiple documents. There's a submit button and a history button. So as I start to enter this transaction, and I create my attachment, and I just wanted to show you, I just created a spreadsheet, a little dummy invoice. And then you can see that I put in my comments. So need to have to prepare for computer lab. All right, so then that would then go through the workflow process, just like we've talked about with vendor approval, just like we've talked about with all of the other GP workflows that we've talked about. So as I compare ReQlogic to GP on this side, you know, GP workflow leverages Active Directory. It's included in your GP licensing. It provides document attachment, but this does require on the submitter side, on the actual entry of the invoice, it requires a full user license. But again, the approvers require no license because everything is done in email. ReQlogic provides a more flexible routing policy if you need it. It also includes document attachment, but where it differentiates itself is it provides budget comparison functionality as well. And it has less costly user licenses because it doesn't require a full GP license. So these are options that you can choose as you look for payables approval. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to finish the next 10 minutes really talking about some reporting options, and then what we'll do is have some time at the end if there are any questions. But are there any questions right now in regards to payables transaction workflow?
Nope, there's no questions.
Okay. So what we have here is this is actually a tool called Smartview. You can use SmartList to do the same thing, but what we were trying to do is maybe give you a little bit of a insight into an inexpensive tool that kind of makes SmartList better. So what this allows us to do is, first of all, inherently, all SmartLists have subtotals in Smartview. Also, Smartview can be run inside and outside of GP. So I can actually have the SmartList experience without being a GP user. The other thing is it's really easy to select the fields that I need, so I don't have to click on any extra buttons. I can simply scroll up and down and pick the fields that I want, and I can create hierarchy. So in this case, what I did is I created a view that has PO status, and so you can see here I have released, and as I would scroll down, I might have received, etc. And then I can sort that by status and then by vendor. And so what you'll see here is I now have subtotals per vendor and per status. So right down here I have a double total because each one of these vendors has a total, and then this is my total for released purchase orders. This is another example where I'm actually looking at it kind of the opposite. Here's my first sort is vendor and then the document status. So what you can see here is the individual purchase order, the type of purchase order, what item, and the description, how much is ordered, unit cost, and everything subtotal, just like we talked about before. So this is just another option. You clearly can get a lot of good information out of your traditional SmartList. We chose not to show SmartList just because most of you probably use it. There are a lot of out-of-the-box SmartLists that are available for you on the purchasing side, and you should feel free to investigate what those are. And then lastly, from a reporting perspective, what I wanted to talk about is Power BI. So this is a really important aspect of being more productive. being able to report on your data in a variety of different ways. So Power BI is a cloud-based solution that has the ability to pull data from Dynamics GP, but also a variety of other SQL-based tools, other solutions out there. And you can create all kinds of different forms. So you can see I have a donut graph, I have a bar graph, I have a map graph, I just have totals. And the other thing that's really important about this is that I can interact. So I can simply click on a year and it will change my all of my views based upon the criteria that I've just set. So it is, the other thing that's really nice is I can run this on just about any device. So whether I'm using an iPad, an iPhone, an Android device, or just a regular desktop or a Microsoft Windows environment, this will run anywhere. So if I'm an executive that's always on the go and has a tablet, this can go with me anywhere. And it does put things in a nice view for an executive to be able to evaluate trends and get a big picture idea of what's going on within the organization. These views are focused on POs and purchasing, but you can create a variety of these. So the nice thing about the tool is because it's cloud-based, it's a subscription. It's $9.99 per user per month. Socius has created a variety of tools that can bolt on. We call it Socius Analytics, and you have access to those that, and I don't have the exact dollars in front of me, but somewhere in the $40 to $50 range per user per month. But these are all pre-built Power BI dashboards that are leveraging your Dynamics GP data. So here's an example. Here's a few more. And we've gotten really creative on some of this. So you got late deliveries, average days to deliver, count of late deliveries, quantities canceled. All of this information can be made available to you. Here you can see additional purchase order date, quantity ordered by item. Your triggers can be the year, the PO status, the vendor, the item. All of these can be used to leverage and create the potential graphic information that you want. So with all that said, I've taken nearly an hour of your time. I wanted to kind of sum it up. So, we've talked about Dynamics GP requisitions, Dynamics GP purchase order processing, and Dynamics GP purchase order generator. All very valuable tools included in licensing that you own today. I've also talked about ReQlogic, which is an advanced workflow tool that allows you to do requisitions. It allows you to do vendor onboarding. It also allows you to do payables invoice approvals as well. And then lastly, we talked about a couple reporting options, E1 Smartview, Power BI, and that's just complement to the variety of Dynamics GP reports that exist inside of your solution today. Some other considerations that I've talked about as we've gone through this, there are demand planning or MRP solutions. So if you're a manufacturer or if you need more advanced functionality around your purchasing, there are demand planning tools that are available. And another thing that's out there is vendor contract pricing. So if you get pricing from your vendors and it gets updated on some period of time, we can manage that using vendor pricing management solutions. So things to think about. There's a variety of different tools that are available to help you leverage and streamline your process of GP. So what we hope you get after you've done all this is you eliminate redundancies because everything's working together. You improve your data integrity. You enhance your visibility through the reporting tools we talked about. You also eliminate business silos because basically your workflow is pushing the transaction across the organization. And it also provides you with controls and security that your paper solution or your interoffice mail or those types of things may not provide you. So with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Lindsay for a minute, and then we can field any questions that you may have.
Perfect, thank you. Just a couple of things before we wrap up today with questions. All upcoming events and webinars can be found on our website at socius1.com. And then our next GP webinar is this Thursday, November 16th from 1 to 2 Eastern, a day in the life of paperless office, document management, and workflow automation. And then our next one, there's a few more to wrap up the year. Thursday, November 30th, improving your budgeting and forecasting. And then stay tuned as we plan for next year's webinar series. So, and then as always, feel free to reach out to Jeff if you have any questions. He'll put his contact information here up shortly. And then, yeah, if you have any questions, just go ahead and put them in the question box or raise your hand and we will get those answered. Alrighty, well, if there's no other questions, we'll give you guys time back in your day, but if anything comes up after, as you think about this or watch this presentation again, just go ahead and reach out to us and we will get those answered. So thanks everyone for joining us today.